Iran, 1979. The worst hostage crisis in American history begins. Unknown to the world at the time, US Embassy staff escape and find their way to the house of Canadian diplomats, where they spend 85 days in hiding.
The longer that we were in hiding, the more the potential was that we would be found.
When the Central Intelligence Agency learn of the Americans on the run, they assign one of their top escape agents, Tony Mendez, to get them out. He comes up with an extraordinary plan to walk the diplomats out of Iran in broad daylight, posing as a Hollywood film crew.
It was a perfect example of truth being stranger than fiction.
The CIA now pushes its tradecraft to the limit as they set out to disguise and train 6 ordinary Americans in the art of escape. This is the real-life story of what would later become an Oscar-winning Hollywood sensation. But what isn't in the Hollywood version are the extraordinary details of an operation the CIA kept hidden away in classified files until now.
It's the secret story of how the CIA fooled everyone.
In late 1979, thousands of anti-American protesters in Iran are gathering outside the US Embassy. Demonstrations against America are common. Iran is still in the throes of an Islamic revolution, and America is being accused of aiding and abetting the hated exiled dictator, the Shah Reza Pahlavi. This is one of hundreds of protests organized by militant revolutionary students. But this time, it's different.
Few of them had makeshift weapons, bike chains or a baseball bat, though some of them did have pistols. Massive crowd, 1,000 people, roaring, "Down with America, death to Carter."
Inside the embassy, staff can see the disturbance from the office windows. Shortly after 9 a.m., the chains of the gate are cut. A small breakaway group of student militants heads for the main embassy building, the Chancery.
They broke the window and they were able to enter into the basement. The Iranians made their way up to the second floor. I captured some Americans and said, "Let us in, otherwise, we'll harm these people."
Adjacent to the Chancery is another building, the consulate. Inside, there are more Americans. One of them is Mark Lyjek.
We started hearing kind of a hubbub coming from the waiting area. People talking about demonstrators roaming inside the compound.
Mark Lyjek's wife, Cora, is also in the consulate.
We did hear footsteps on the roof, and we thought that maybe somebody was going to try to get in and find access into the building, so that was a bit scary.
All the lights went out. Apparently the demonstrators had gotten into the power station and cut off the power.
Someone threw a brick or a rock through the window, and the Marine went running in and saw a guy climbing up a ladder.
The diplomats now realize that the embassy compound is completely overrun by demonstrators. At first, one of the US Marines guarding the consulate advises them to stay inside the building. They hear on the radio that armed militants are trying to kidnap the rest of the Americans. They now know that they're in grave danger. They must escape fast.
They realized that the Chancery had been broken into and that they really couldn't hold out any longer.
They're advised to head to the nearby British embassy with the help of a local Iranian guide. So they make their way to a side door of the consulate that leads directly onto the streets of Tehran. Only steps away are thousands and thousands of angry Iranian protesters. Among the first out are Mark and Cora Lijek.
When I first left the embassy, I was certainly nervous. I felt very conspicuous.
We were trying not to stand out. We were trying to blend in with the people that were walking away.
Step by step, trying to get away.
They are followed by Joe Stafford, his wife Kathy, and Bob Anders. The five avoid the angry crowds now behind them and head southwest towards the British embassy, led by their Iranian guide.
She pulled me to the side, and the rest of our group also went to the side, and she says, there's a demonstration, we can't go there.
We saw a demonstration there, so we decided that's not a good idea.
In the end, they head to Bob Anders' apartment and remain there, terrified of stepping back onto the streets of Tehran. In Washington, while the embassy crisis is unfolding, it's still the early hours of Sunday morning. Calls from Iran begin to trickle in to the State Department. The president is alerted as dawn rises. And so is the Central Intelligence Agency.
Upon receiving the information that the embassy had been overrun, the CIA would have immediately been concerned for the safety of its people.
By the time America wakes up, the revolutionary students have declared a victory. Day one of the world's biggest ever international hostage crisis has begun.
They were paraded in front of the cameras, and this was a big victory for the students. I mean, they were very surprised that they'd actually been able to pull it off.
66 Americans are now being held hostage at gunpoint. At this stage, the CIA have no idea that there's a group of diplomats on the run.
We felt very dangerous, a very dangerous situation.
What happens next is not portrayed in the Hollywood movie. After their first night in hiding, the escapees make a nail-biting series of overnight stays at 5 different locations in Tehran. This includes the British ambassador's residence. This takes place over 6 grueling days.
They're literally going from house to house to house.
The most terrifying time was either Wednesday or Thursday night. All night long, the local watchman kept blowing a whistle about every 10 or 15 minutes. Our nerves were raw.
The 6 days that we spent on our own was the scariest time. The Iranians were rounding people up because the other Americans that we'd been in touch with in the first days who were still out were gradually being arrested, seized.
Desperate, and with no idea what to do, Bob Anders remembers a friend in the Canadian embassy and gives him a call. His name is John Sheardown.
Bob said, well, I'm not alone. There's 5 of us. And John said, bring them all.
Six days after they first step out of the US Embassy onto the streets of Tehran, the escapees finally reach the Canadian house. With their fellow Americans held hostage at gunpoint, they themselves are now effectively fugitives at large in Iran. Terrified of being caught, confused about what to do next, and exhausted, they now have just one hope: rescue by the CIA.
I had the sense anyway that Washington had sort of forgotten about us.
1 month after the embassy takeover, and the State Department is still consumed by the ever-worsening hostage crisis.
The American hostages.
No act has so galvanized the American public toward unity in the last decade as has the holding of our people as hostages in Tehran.
While State Department staff grapple with how to deal with the embassy, they also become aware of the 6 escapees through information sent from Canadian officials in Tehran. The State Department turns to the CIA. In early December, a series of top-secret flash cables arrive on the desk of an intelligence officer called Tony Mendez. Flash cables are the highest priority communications, usually restricted to wars or the most urgent of information.
Tony saw these cables on his desk, and at the top of them were these marked flash, which you almost never see. In fact, some communicators, he told me, can go their whole careers without ever seeing one.
The flash cables are about the escaped diplomats.
On December 10th, when Tony heard that there were 6 Americans stranded outside the embassy, immediately his mind would have kicked into gear.
Tony Mendez is a rising star within the CIA. He's carried out numerous undercover rescue operations, which the agency call exfiltrations, or extracting assets out of dangerous places.
His job was getting people out of tough spots, rescuing people from dangerous areas.
He's known as the Master of Disguise and works in a highly secretive specialist department known as OTS.
OTS is the Office of Technical Service, and they are the CIA's gadget makers.
These are the people in the film James Bond, which would be the Q. You know, these are they give the equipment.
With the arrival of the flash cables, Mendez and the OTS are about to receive their biggest challenge yet.
Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
Mendez is called to a meeting at the State Department.
They discuss what they thought they should do to help rescue these people. Tony immediately sort of let them know that they should let him and the experts at the CIA worry about this. And they did.
The rescue is now in Mendez's hands. Along with his team of specialists at OTS, he sets to work on a plan that will get them out in broad daylight. The first problem: the escapees are American, and the Iranian authorities will be on the lookout for any Americans trying to leave the country.
The U.S. is the hated enemy.
The second problem is that the diplomats are untrained in spy tradecraft. They simply won't have the ability of accomplished agents to suddenly adopt an alien identity.
They were completely unwitting of this black world in which people can be exfiltrated.
So Mendez wants to find them a plausible reason to be in Iran, which will fool the Iranians, and one which any ordinary English-speaking American can fake.
The key is, if they spoke English, what other possible country wasn't Iran mad at? The answer, of course, is Canada.
Mendez has a hunch that Canada offers the diplomats their best chance. But he's worried that the Canadian government won't break its own protocol and issue citizens from another country fake passports.
Unfortunately, the Canadians had a law that said, you can't just give out passports to anybody. The foreign minister, along with the prime minister, got together and they were able to sort of circumvent the parliament so that they could pass this exception to their laws.
With the Canadian passports secured, next, Mendez now needs a cover story.
He wanted to create a story that was so unbelievable, so crazy and over the top that no one would believe that it was fake.
After endless days and nights searching for the perfect cover story, Mendez hits on an idea. Suppose the diplomats are Canadians who are part of a Hollywood film crew, and their cover story is that they're on a special trip to look at filming locations. Despite the revolution, the cultural sector of the new Iranian government still wants to attract foreign currency, and that includes film investment.
The plan is implausible. It's improbable that it would work. It is fraught with problems, and 1,000 things could go wrong.
Not the least of the problems is that Mendez knows little about Hollywood film crews. So he calls up an old friend in California, John Chambers, an Oscar-winning makeup artist famous for his effects on Planet of the Apes.
So he called his friend, John Chambers, to find out if it would be feasible and what kind of people would go on a location scouting party. And after Chambers ticked off the various jobs that a person would have, Tony realized that it was a perfect solution.
Back in Iran, the escapees are following developments in the ongoing hostage crisis at the US Embassy.
We had an old television, so we did see some footage of the hostages blindfolded and being led around.
They're completely helpless at the mercy of this crowd of people around them pushing them out, and that was pretty scary.
The diplomats have been joined by one more, Lee Schatz, another American working at the embassy, whose escape had been engineered by the Swedes. The 6 are now known as the house guests, after living with the Canadians for what, by Christmas, is now well over 40 days.
The longer that we were in hiding, the more the potential was that we would be found.
Day by day, the danger for the house guests is increasing. Odds are that sooner or later the diplomats will be discovered and turned over to the authorities. It's now a race against time. In early January, Mendez goes to Los Angeles on a 4-day trip to execute the first stage of his elaborate Hollywood ruse by visiting his old friend, John Chambers. With him, $10,000 of CIA cash, hidden in a secret compartment of his briefcase.
Tony had to come out to Los Angeles to try to put this plan into motion. Goes to John Chambers' house, and they sit down.
Mendez turns to Chambers and a colleague of his, Bob Seidel, to help him build up what will look like a genuine Hollywood production from scratch.
Bob was really surprised when he shows up at John Chambers' house, and they're sitting in the breakfast nook, and then here's a CIA officer saying, we have to rescue some Americans who are stuck on the lam in Tehran. That was not what he expected that morning.
The 3 work fast and quickly find the script of an unmade film called Lord of Light.
Tony says, this is exactly what we need. It kind of has a Middle Eastern feel to it. So he says, let's call it Argo. And they realize that it also has a kind of mythical connotation. Jason and the Argonauts, it's the ship that the Argonauts sailed on. And Tony says, this is perfect.
With the script problem solved, next, they need a Hollywood office.
We're just coming up here on Sunset Gower Studios. This is the lot that used to be the Columbia lot, actually. And this is where Tony and John Chambers and Bob Seidel took over an office that had just been occupied by Michael Douglas for the China Syndrome, and it was empty, so that's where they set up their fake film production.
Mendez names the production company Studio 6, after the 6 diplomats he must rescue. Chambers and Seidel agree to run it on behalf of the CIA. While in California, Mendez also turns his attention to the minutiae of the operation, collecting what the CIA call pocket litter. Pocket litter refers to all the tiny details which the authorities might check during the escape.
Tony would have had to consider every possibility. Everything from the labels on their clothing down to matchbooks that came from Ottawa, are bits that would be associated either with the movie industry or with Canada. Everything had to support the central cover.
Preparations for the exfiltration do not stop here. When Mendez gets back to OTS offices, he draws on his huge team of CIA technical specialists to work on the details.
He was supported by literally hundreds of people. He had disguise specialists. He had graphics people. He had document validators, how to talk about forgery. He had individuals that could talk about clothing. What would a Canadian film crew look like?
Back in Iran, the house guests have now been in hiding not for days, but months. The endless waiting has begun to unnerve them. And by this stage, any small incident is enough to cause huge alarm.
We had one incident where a helicopter flew low, very low, over the house. It scared us. We were tense. Even though we were in a safe place, it didn't take much to trigger this sort of flight response or panic, whatever you want to call it.
Fear, paranoia, and frustration. Their combined effect begins to wear down the mental state of the trapped diplomats. Their worries are well-founded. Inside the US Embassy, the hostages are being mistreated, even being subjected to terrifying mock executions. Despite the pressure, the house guests do whatever they can just to get through the endless weeks in hiding. This is helped by their Canadian hosts, the Sheardowns.
The atmosphere that was created by the Sheardowns through the family kind of setup that we had, the social events that they did for us, I think they helped us as much as possible have a normal life.
I think John realized that in order to keep us mentally healthy, you might say, that there were certain things that they could do. One of them was the routine that we had with the formal dinner and the conversation following. Another was they would have parties for us a couple times a month. They would invite people from other embassies, such as the New Zealanders and the Danish ambassador, people who knew about us, so that we could have normal social interaction with people outside of our very limited circle.
Some of their most memorable occasions include both a Thanksgiving and a Christmas feast, enjoyed in the sumptuous setting of John Sheardown's diplomatic house.
Due to a strange fluke, the Sheardowns had stocked their basement with alcohol because they were next in line to host one of these embassy functions that the foreign diplomats would have. Obviously that didn't happen because of the embassy takeover that sort of shut all that stuff down, but the house guests had this abundant supply of wine and liquor and these kinds of things, so they often threw themselves little parties and they drank. But there was also a lot of tension, and there were some tense moments when they were worried about being discovered.
I felt like we were on the Titanic, and that we didn't know when we were going to hit the iceberg, but unlike the people on the real Titanic, we knew that there were icebergs out there and that it was potentially possible that any day we could run into one.
Unable to leave the house and living behind closed doors, the diplomats pass endless hours in whatever way they can. It's just a waiting game.
John Sheardown had a big library. We did a lot of reading. I read 27 books during that time. I think Mark Lyjak more than doubled that. We played Monopoly, Scrabble, Bridge. You know, there's always the worry in the back of your mind, you know, that we might be caught.
They became a bit stir crazy. They had to stay inside. There were times when visitors would come over to the house, they would lock themselves in their room, they would hide under the bed. They were very nervous about making an untoward sound, anything that could attract attention.
In Washington, the CIA also feel the pressure. Mendez sets a date for the exfiltration, January 25th, 1980. The risks are so great that rather than send another agent, he'll go there himself. He selects a colleague, codenamed Julio, who speaks Farsi, the language of Iran, to travel with him. The CIA are also in contact with the Canadian ambassador, Kenneth Taylor, who has been protecting the house guests since the start. Soon Mendez will meet them all face to face, and their freedom will pass from the hands of the Canadians to those of the CIA agents. If it all goes wrong and fails, then ultimately their own lives could also be on the line. Almost 3 months since the first day of the diplomats' escape, top intelligence agent Tony Mendez and a colleague codenamed Julio arrive in Iran. Most of this time, the Canadian ambassador has been in secret communication with the CIA and knows they're coming. When they arrive at the Canadian diplomat's house, the house guests have no idea what to expect.
2 gentlemen in trench coats showed up, which was appropriate, of course. Tony introduced himself as Kevin Harkins. There was another gentleman with him, but he stayed in the background pretty much.
The man who calls himself Kevin Harkins, in fact, Tony Mendez, immediately begins to assess the diplomat's mental state after 80 days in hiding.
When Tony joined the group, he selectively and very carefully began to analyze each one of them, saying, who is the individual that I least need to worry about? And who do I need to focus on?
Mendez is looking out for the weakest link, the person most likely to panic during the escape. The house guests are also making an assessment of their own. Can this man really get them out of here? And how?
When Tony offered the Hollywood scenario, I liked it immediately.
They set up an office in Hollywood, and everyone had their business card, and here's mine right here.
The Argo plan impresses most of the house guests, but not all of them are immediately convinced.
I got to admit, I was taken aback by it because it's not something I'd been thinking about for the last 3 months.
The challenge for Mendez is to open the diplomats' eyes to an entirely new illusionary world of falsity and pretense. They must somehow come to terms with playing Hollywood characters that don't exist, except in the eyes of the Iranians. So Mendez plays a small conjurer's trick on them to get them thinking about the deception they'll have to perform themselves to escape.
So he comes in and he performs this little parlor trick that he does with 2 corks. He holds them in his hand, kind of forming 2 Ds, and he magically separates them, making it look as if one cork has passed through the other.
And I know it was just a trick, it was just a sleight of hand, but somehow I was kind of amazed by the little hand trick. I thought, well, he can do this, and he's saying he's got all this experience, so I think that we can trust him.
I think he said this is the point of it. It's the whole thing is an illusion, trying to put something over on somebody. You're playing a role. You're a different person, so you're trying to fool somebody. So it's not real. It's an illusion.
These are the very first moments that the master of disguise has with the house guests. Just the beginning of the preparations. He knows the Hollywood plan is a big ask for civilians not used to undercover operations. Even so, Mendez issues them with their aliases, the people they're going to have to pretend to be on the day of the escape. Cora Lyjek is told that she is no longer Mark Lyjek's wife, but the Hollywood scriptwriter, Teresa Harris.
Someone had obviously read our files because my birthday was my mother's month and day, and it was my year. So it was things that I already knew. And I actually went to school with a woman named Teresa Harris, who shares my actual real birthday. I don't know if that's a fluke.
The next day, CIA agents Tony Mendez and Julio drive through Tehran to the Canadian embassy. Here, they have to perform a critical piece of CIA tradecraft, forging the travel documents of the 6 escapees. Watched by the Canadian ambassador, Kenneth Taylor, Mendez forges the travel documents. He needs to create a record of these false identities having entered Iran.
And he'd have had a number of tools. He would have had, of course, a magnifying glass. He would have had a forger's kit. And he would have used what's called the forger's bridge, which is a way to rest his hands on the document that don't smear the ink, but allow him to put in the final details. If they look too perfect, there's something wrong with them. But if they're too haphazard, they may not be believable.
To match the ink used by the Iranian authorities, Mendez uses an ink pad supplied by the CIA. But it has dried up and doesn't work.
Now, here is where the artistic side of Tony comes in. He walks over to Ken Taylor's liquor cabinet. He selects a scotch with a high octane quality. He pours some scotch onto the pad. And sure enough, they come out perfectly.
It's the final day of the escape preparations. Tomorrow, they will head to Tehran's airport and try to flee the country. But Mendez and Julio are not sure that the house guests are adequately prepared.
So on Sunday night, Tony goes back to the Sheerdowns to meet up with the house guests, and he's very surprised by what he sees.
What he sees is that the house guests are scrambling through all their clothes, completely absorbed in the characters they will play. They have to transform themselves from bureaucrats into fashionable Hollywood filmmakers.
Bob Anders, I think, won the prize, though. I mean, he decided to become very flamboyant. I think he unbuttoned his shirt down to about the middle of his chest. Bob has quite a bit of chest hair, so he displayed that prominently. I'm looking out of my shirt, and I thought, well, maybe if I had some kind of a chain, with a medallion or something, and that would fit, that'd be sort of Hollywood-ish. And so then I said, yeah, that's the me, that's the new me, that's Robert Baker, that works for Studio 6.
The house guests begin to enjoy playing their flamboyant Hollywood characters. But Mendez is still concerned that they haven't yet taken on board the full gravity of the escape. So with the help of Roger Lucy, a colleague of the ambassador, he decides to put them through a mock interrogation.
And he took it very seriously. He actually wore these leather boots, he had a camouflage jacket, a little swagger stick. And he got right in their faces.
Roger, he was playing his role as the interrogator. He was playing it to the hilt, so he gave him some kind of a very serious threat. I forget exactly what it was, but something like he was going to be taken away and probably executed. And this gave us all a little start. Said, well, yeah, have to take this thing seriously, and it's not just a game that we're playing.
I think the point was to make sure that we had those answers down so fast that we could spit them out and not give us time to think, to remember. They had to be right there. We had to be able to recall them immediately, and it was effective, I think.
After only 2 days of preparation, Mendez decides the time has come for the diplomats to make a break for it. If he's right, it could be their ticket out. But if he's wrong, their freedom, even their lives, could be on the line. The day of reckoning has arrived. Once the group enters the airport, there will be no turning back.
This was the moment of truth. He knew that this was life or death.
As day breaks, Mendez enters the airport, soon to be followed by the 6 diplomats.
The initial shock of entering a brightly lit, crowded place after being in hiding for 3 months definitely was something to deal with.
After checking in their bags, they face their first big test, getting through passport control. But right from the start, it looks like it could go wrong. Lee Schatz breaks away from the house guests and their agreed plan.
And Lee was sort of standing there, a little nervous. He was beginning to look around, a little worried.
The customs official looks at Lee Schatz's passport photo, notices his moustache, and thinks maybe it's a different person.
Immigrations officer looked at him, looked at his photo, did a double take. And then took his passport and left and went into a back room.
Mendez can only watch from a distance, hoping Schatz won't panic.
Tony's greatest fear was that they would panic, they would break cover, they would confess, refuse to go through the screening process, and literally be frozen by fear. And it's this point, even a tiny bead of sweat running off their forehead could betray the fact that these passports weren't legitimate.
When the official comes back, Schatz tries to explain that he's trimmed his moustache, and it really is him in the photograph.
And he basically told the guy, well, I trimmed my mustache. Then he stamped the passport and he let him go.
After Lee Schatz, the rest of the house guests file through passport control. But the team are not yet through. Ahead, they still face the riskiest part of the escape, presenting their departure forms at final immigration.
All of this work came up to the point is, could the departure forms that they were carrying, would they be matched to the originals?
White forms, in theory, filled in on entry to Iran, but which the escapees don't have, must match the yellow exit forms Mendez has forged. If the officials try to cross-check the forms against each other, it will all go wrong. It's a chance Mendez has to take.
If any one of the 6 had failed, they would not only have been arrested, but Tony likely would have been shot.
You feel very powerless.
When we got to the immigration desk, there was no one there.
Cora went kind of in the back there and started yelling. And nobody came, so she yelled again, and this sleepy-looking guy came out carrying a teapot, and he put the teapot down, and he grabbed our passports, pulled the cards out, handed them back to us, and didn't even look at us at all at any point in this process. And we thanked him, and then we headed off to the departure lounge.
All 6 escapees make it through the critical stage. The official hardly looks at the yellow forms that Mendez has forged. The house guests now assemble in the departure lounge, waiting for their flight call. Then, bad news.
We are sorry to inform you that Swiss Air Flight 363 will be delayed due to mechanical problems.
Something always happens unexpected, and in this instance, it does. The flight is delayed.
The delay means that their chances of being found out are now increasing. Minute after minute, the elite Revolutionary Guards, who Mendez hoped to avoid, are now coming on duty. They're trained to be on the lookout for spies. The delay means that the diplomats must maintain their disguises potentially for hours.
You feel very powerless, and that makes the time drag even longer.
They don't know, are the Revolutionary Guard onto them? Are they scrutinizing the papers? Are they going to be matching the white and yellow copies?
The worry for Mendez is, how long can they maintain their disguises before they give everything away? And can they hold their nerve in front of the feared Revolutionary Guards?
The longer we were there, the greater the chance of somebody recognizing any one of us.
The delayed flight has left the escapees exposed. Kathy, Joe, and Cora Lyjak have more reason to be worried than the others. Because they work in the visa section of the consulate, dealing with Iranians every day, their faces are familiar. They could be spotted at any time.
Kathy, Joe, and I had all worked on the visa line. I was worried that just by coincidence, somebody in the airport would recognize Kathy, Joe, or myself. I don't think we were talking very much. We'd kind of gotten quiet. We'd done everything we could. We just wanted to get out of that room and onto the airplane.
The presence of the Revolutionary Guards, who are now coming on duty, ramps up the pressure to another level.
The departure lounge itself is filling up. As the day is progressing, more and more Revolutionary Guards are coming in. They're beginning to harass the people.
As they wait, Mendez sees that the Revolutionary Guards are stopping other passengers and questioning them.
They're looking for Iranians who are trying to steal wealth and leave the country, but they're starting to turn and look at foreigners as well.
After years of carrying out undercover exfiltrations, Mendez knows that it's in these unexpected moments that the escapees are most likely to panic. They have already begun to make their first mistakes. For Mendez, this is nerve-wracking.
One of the people in the group really didn't want to leave. He felt we were abandoning the hostages. He never really got into the story and the role. In fact, when we went to the waiting room, he called me by my real name, Cora. Mark and I moved away from that person and decided to kind of keep a distance from them.
Another mistake is when a nervous house guest picks up an Iranian newspaper, written in the local language of Farsi. It will be highly unlikely for a Hollywood filmmaker to be doing this. Exactly the kind of giveaway a trained Revolutionary Guard would be looking for.
Tony went over to him and said, put the paper down. You should probably not be a Farsi speaker or be able to read it. And he did. He put it down.
Mendez cannot afford a third mistake. Just one glance by a Revolutionary Guard at the wrong moment, and they all go down.
During the delay, Tony could do essentially one thing to assuage the fears of the six, and that's be calm.
Those last 30 minutes in the waiting area seemed to drag on forever. Every minute passing very, very slowly.
When they glanced over at him, they couldn't see panic, they couldn't see fear, only the normal countenance, the rock, the steadiness.
If you could take your blood pressure at each different point along the line, it'd probably be pretty high.
This was kind of a draining experience going through the airport, and I just wanted to be on the aircraft at that stage. That was it.
Finally, at around 8:30 a.m., there's a second announcement.
Passengers for Swiss Air Flight 363 for Zurich, please approach the boarding gate.
Finally, they hear the announcement. Swiss Air flight is boarding.
We really felt good to actually getting on the bus, going out to the plane. That was beginning to feel that, well, maybe it's really going to work, it's really going to happen.
As they leave, there is no dramatic police chase along the runway. Flight 363 takes off without further incident. A few hours later, it lands in Zurich, Switzerland.
I wanted to say thank you and goodbye to Tony, but when I turned around, he was gone.
I'm not even sure we had a chance to shake hands with Tony and Julio. They went off, and for them it was just another day at the office, I guess, but obviously for us it was a life-changing experience.
Tony knows they're going on with their lives, but he knows that this is just one of many operations, and his primary objective at that point is drift off into the shadows.
The Argo escape plan is kept secret for 17 years. The files are eventually declassified, and the world would learn of one of the CIA's most extraordinary operations.
It's the secret story of how the CIA fooled everyone.
Argo is a perfect example of truth being stranger than fiction. I mean, it's hard to imagine that this is real. And I think that was the genius of Argo.